Hello everyone, peace be upon you. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Also, leave a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story has reached. For those of you who have already subscribed, I sincerely wish you good health, ease in all your affairs, abundant blessings, and may all your hopes and dreams come true. Amen. Now, let's begin the story. The military courthouse at Naval Station San Diego felt like a ship sealed tight against the weather, oak walls polished to a mirror sheen, brass fixtures gleaming, air-conditioned air that smelled faintly of paper and old salt. Commander Jessica, Jace, Whitman stood at attention in dress blues that hadn't seen a wrinkle in years. Her posture was economy and control, the kind of stillness earned on wind-scoured ridgelines where a heartbeat could nudge a shot off target. She didn't blink much, she catalogued exits, distances, angles. She listened more than she looked. All rise. The clerk's voice bounced under the flags. Judge Colonel Richard Hargrove swept to the bench with the practiced authority of a man whose orders never met a headwind. Ribbons shone on his chest, administrative weight without the dust of far countries. He sat. The gallery settled into a hush that wasn't quite respectful, it was expectant, amused in places. A folded newspaper corner peeked from a briefcase with a headline about a female SEAL claimant under investigation. A couple of officers traded small, satisfied grins. Commander Whitman, the clerk read, "You stand charged with falsifying service records, misrepresenting qualifications, and conduct unbecoming." Jace's defense counsel, the appointed one, kept his eyes on his pad like a man hoping to be dismissed for an early lunch. He pled not guilty for her. The judge asked if she understood the stakes, career, honor, the long fall downward. She answered once, "Yes, sir," then returned to silence. Wythe rose for the government. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Wythe carried himself like every podium was built for him. He laid out his case the way a contractor lays out rebar, straight lines, sharp corners, confident there would be concrete poured on top. The integrity of special operations, the impossibility of her timelines, the physical standards, the law's intolerance for myth-making. He gestured to a screen that hadn't turned on yet and promised the court they would see what it needed to see. Jace waited it out with the patience of long surveillance. She knew the rhythm of rooms, the warm-up, the tightening, the moment when noise becomes signal. When Hargrove nodded, she stepped to the center as if measuring a wind that only she could feel. "Your Honor, I request to represent myself." A lift of brows, a quick exchange between bench and prosecutor, the faintest ripple of amusement. She didn't chase it. "I understand procedure. I understand pressure. I understand decisions with permanent consequences." Her voice was even, not loud, the kind that carries anyway. Hargrove granted it with warning and condescension layered like paint. The appointed counsel gathered his papers with relief and slipped out. The room sensed sport. Jace returned to her mark and let her breathing settle into the quiet tempo she used on long stalks. Opening statements. Wythe went first, painting her as an opportunist who found seams in systems and stitched herself a legend. He spoke of BUD/S as a crucible that does not bend, of records that do not reconcile, of deployments that vanish under scrutiny. The murmurs behind Jace gained confidence. Skepticism began to feel like consensus. She didn't pace when it was her turn. She said her words carefully, like placing glass on stone. "My record, in full, speaks clearly," she said. "What has been shown is not full. Compartmentalization cuts holes in fabric, what remains can be made to look like something else." She didn't flinch at the judge's face, at the prosecutor's pen half-cocked to object. "I won't violate security. I will show how selective absence is not the same as proof of fraud." No one clapped. A captain near the aisle smirked into his hand. Hargrove polished his glasses as if clearer lenses might change the line of her jaw. "Proceed," he said. "We'll have evidence, not philosophy." The door opened for the first witness. Commander Victor Landry came in with shoulders that filled the space and a face the sun had carved. Evaluations, standards, times, distances, he spoke the language the court wanted to hear. He would talk about mud and cold and the weight of logs and the exactness of stopwatches. The screen flickered to life, frozen on a frame of bodies in surf, a face half buried in foam that could have been anyone. Jace watched the jury panel, the way heads tilt when a story confirms what they came in believing. She noted Hargrove's cadence, where his breath caught and where it didn't. She mapped Wythe's tells, the quick sip of water before a point he liked, the slower blink when something didn't fit quite right. She kept her hands at her sides, the calluses invisible inside white gloves, the memory of wind calculations drifting past the courtroom's recycled air. Outside, the California sun hit the flag just right, stripes snapping once, then twice. Inside, the clock moved like a metronome. The court reporter typed, the gallery leaned forward, the judge nodded for the play button. Landry inhaled to begin. And Jace, who had stood at 1,000 horizons where nothing is certain and everything matters, let the room press closer, let the tide of doubt rise up the walls, and waited for the right second to turn it. The video began with spray and grit and bodies crawling under a gray Pacific sky. Landry narrated like a metronome, timestamps, evolutions, failure points. A clip of Jace slipping in surge, a medic's hand on her shoulder, a grimace frozen mid-frame. Wythe let each frame breathe just long enough to stain. The gallery murmured, someone exhaled a small, satisfied laugh that didn't carry a name. Hargrove watched over his glasses with the expression of a man collecting confirmation. Objection, Jace said once, steady. Selective edits from early phase, lacking full-cycle context. Overruled, crisp and clean. She didn't bristle. She took notes, small and neat, like plotting wind shifts on a field card. Landry described standards as immovable pillars. He'd never seen a woman meet sustained load over time. He said, technically, a lot, like the word itself could launder bias. Wythe paced his aisle cuts. Minimum thresholds, he pressed, suggest accommodation. Heads nodded. The weight of it felt like sand piling in a boot. Cross-exam. Jace moved to the line with the same economy she carried everywhere. Commander Landry, medical interventions during Hell Week, were they unique to me? A beat. No, common. Common enough. Records keep final phase scores. Yes. Did I meet published standards? Landry's jaw ticked. Technically. She let the word hang, then set it gently on the table between them. Thank you. No further. Master Chief Thomas Grayson came next, stone face, ocean-worn. 27 years, Team 4, never saw her in any operational space. Could a female operator deploy without your knowledge? Wythe asked. Absolutely not. The room liked that answer. It sounded simple, simple feels safe. Jace stepped in again. Master Chief, were you briefed on all special access operations? He hesitated like a door on a stiff hinge. I was briefed on what I needed. Ever heard of cross-team elements built for specific parameters? Wythe popped up, classification, but the judge let the general question ride. It happens, Grayson allowed. So it's possible, Jace said, that something occurred outside your line of sight. Not a trap, not a gotcha, just a quiet turn of the dial. He didn't like agreeing, but he didn't lie either. Possible, he said. 2 more witnesses repeated the shape, they hadn't seen her, therefore, she wasn't there. Hargrove checked his watch, called lunch, cleared the room. Jace stayed seated, still as a rifle on a ruck. Wythe drifted over with the ease of a man offering mercy from a height. Commander, he said softly, resignation preserves more than a verdict will. She met his eyes and measured distance, wind, ricochet. See you at 1300, Colonel. Afternoon light came in harsher. The courtroom refilled with the low hum of people who believed the outcome had momentum. Captain Daniel Hollister took the stand with polished certitude. He had a folder and a tone that suggested inevitability. 17 discrepancies, he said. Irregular signatures. Courses without corroboration. Deployments that didn't exist where he looked for them. His conclusions landed like stamps. Cross, Hargrove said, almost perfunctory. Jace didn't raise her voice. Captain, did you request access to SAP compartments tied to naval special warfare? Denied by default, he said, a little too quick. Did you ask? No, did you contact JSOC? Standard channels suffice. Are you familiar with long-range interdiction packages authorized for a handful of operators? Wythe jumped, classification, but Jace never chased specifics. She only wanted the outline. Hollister's eyes did a small, involuntary widen before he claimed the privilege of not discussing. It was enough, the room felt the ripple even if it couldn't name the source. The government rests, Wythe announced, sure of the ground under his feet. Hargrove turned, expectant, almost bored. Defense? Jace stood. No witnesses. A chuckle flickered and died in the back row. Argument only, she added. She stepped into the center and faced the bench and the faces behind it. What you've seen is an absence curated by design, she said. Compartmentalization saves lives and erases footprints. That's the point. You're being asked to treat missing as false. In my world, missing often means it worked. Hargrove leaned forward. Commander, this court requires something more tangible than language. He wanted a weight on the scales, not an idea. Jace held his gaze, then nodded once, a decision settling. She asked to approach. The request carried a tone you hear once in a career and never forget. Permission granted, she moved with that fluid, waste-nothing gait. From inside her dress blues she drew a small wooden case, unremarkable to most eyes. She opened it, ribbons arrayed with surgeon neatness, then reached behind the array and drew out a patch worn by time and miles. Black and gold thread, a skull over crosshairs, edges softened by use. She set it on the bench like placing a blade and stepped back. Something happened to the oxygen in the room. Most people didn't know what they were looking at, not exactly, but they knew the judge's color had drained for a reason. Hargrove's hand hovered, trembled, settled. In the back row, a gray-templed admiral rose without waiting for anyone's permission. Your Honor, he said, voice carrying a weight the walls recognized, I request immediate SKIF protocol and limited classification review. Identify, Hargrove managed. Admiral Jonathan Merrick, Deputy Director, Naval Special Warfare Command. The clerk's pen stopped. Security moved before orders. Doors sealed. Signals died. The gallery emptied to a core of ranks and clearances. The patch sat between judge and truth like a quiet, patient witness. Hargrove finally turned it over and saw the tiny serial that shouldn't exist and does. He looked up at Jace as if seeing the outline of a mountain that had been in front of him the whole time. Admiral, he said, voice thin now, verify. Merrick stepped forward, eyes already certain. Verified, he said. 1 of 5. Issued only to operators with 20+ Tier 1 HVT confirmations in denied areas. Individually serialized. DNA coded. He didn't look at Wythe. He didn't have to. The room had pivoted on a single, deliberate ounce of thread and history. Hargrove swallowed. This court will proceed under secure protocol. He said the words, but the meaning was simpler. Everything you thought you knew about the woman at attention in front of you was wrong, and the floor just moved. Jace didn't smile. She didn't look vindicated. She stood the way you stand when a storm shifts, feet set, eyes forward, ready to move from defense to action the second the wind lines up. Jace held the line while the room reconfigured around the patch. Locks thumped into place. Screens that once played training clips now glowed with a sterile SKIF interface. Merrick took a measured breath and began speaking like a man who'd rehearsed truth in a mirror knowing he might never get to say it out loud. The court shrank to a handful of ranks and clearances, everyone else became rumor outside steel doors. He verified what the thread already claimed, few patches exist, issued after more than 20 Tier 1 eliminations in denied territory. Serialized, DNA-coded, non-transferable. The numbers didn't boast, they accounted. Hargrove's posture changed by degrees, arrogance bleeding off into something closer to professional caution. Wythe's notes stopped meaning what they meant 5 minutes prior. Hollister's certainty went brittle at the edges. Under secure protocol, the language turned spare. No mission names, only frames, long glass work from mountain air so thin it throbbed at the temples, hostage corridors cleared because 3 shots landed where math said only 1 would, extractions built on timing so tight a breath wrong would cost lives. Merrick spoke in metrics and Jason almost nothing at all, letting the data be its own witness. The invisible scaffolding of compartmentalization showed through like studs under drywall. Holes in paperwork stopped looking like lies and started looking like design. Then the temperature dropped another notch when the conversation pivoted from who she was to who had tried to erase that fact. Hollister's discrepancies aligned too neatly along a single axis, operators like her, operations like those. Access logs, the Admiral said quietly, were being pulled. Maintenance windows matched deletions. The shapes fit together with a sort of ugly, bureaucratic elegance. Someone wasn't just doubting, someone was sanding the record clean. You didn't need names to feel the outline, but names arrived anyway, reluctant from Hollister at first, then faster when confronted with signatures, time stamps, and routes only a handful could authorize. The line of travel pointed toward the Pentagon East Wing, toward an office where policy got polished until it looked like inevitability. The clock on the courtroom wall felt louder. A scheduled systems maintenance sat on the calendar for that night, late enough for plausible invisibility, long enough to bury 5 years of truth if left alone. Action took its easy shape. Jace requested a secure terminal and authorization to signal Sierra. The cadence of the room shifted with the request, everyone aware of the difference between theory and a switch being thrown. Her authentication rolled out smooth and practiced, the kind of string you only get taught once. The reply came back distorted by design but unmistakable in tone. Sierra acknowledged, countermeasure standing by, QRF inbound to ensure the archive didn't drown quietly. Plans layered fast. Team 1 would ride the maintenance window at the Pentagon server room and put hands on the process before it could turn teeth. NCIS would own the badges and the paperwork, but Sierra would own the timing and the angles, quiet force in plain clothes, the sort you don't notice until a door that should have opened doesn't. Judge Hargrove, chastened and sharp now, began scrawling warrants with the precision of someone trying to pay a debt in exact bills. Every step would land inside the lines, none of them would land late. Merrick cut a path for a parallel move, leadership pressure applied at the source. If authorization for the purge came from a desk, the person at that desk would feel daylight for the first time all day. Names like Warwick floated without flourish, pinned to authorizations that looked like routine if you didn't know where to look. Routine is how most damage is done. Jace understood that better than anyone in the room. She'd built a career preventing routine from turning fatal. Ethan Maddox arrived with the QRF, 8 bodies shaped by quiet miles, no unit patches, only the calm geometry of people who've already rehearsed the worst outcomes and made peace with their odds. He handed Jace a secure tablet preloaded with the ugly map, maintenance schedules, technician rosters, switchover timetables, expected packet loss patterns, and the tiny windows where sabotage dresses up as latency. He didn't ask for glory, he asked for contingencies. She gave him 3, fail open, fail closed, and fail dirty, because systems people always think in binaries and the world always insists on a third option. Wythe tried for one last foothold, a mention of scope and court and limits, but the room had moved past him. This wasn't about saving a case, it was about saving history from a shredder disguised as policy. He recognized the shift and stepped out of the way with a stiffness that looked a lot like learning. They worked the plan into muscle memory in under 20 minutes. Team 1, blend with maintenance staff at ingress, verify identities 2 steps before badge checks to avoid spook tells, control the terminal stack at failover, ghost the purge by looping success prompts while archiving live. NCIS, sit close enough to witness, far enough not to spook, cuffs ready for when an IT contractor shows knowledge no contractor should. Legal, Hargrove's warrant set to trigger on authorization codes the moment they tried to move beyond review into deletion. Sierra, run a shadow capture of every byte that twitched. Parallel track, Merrick, Jace, a smaller element, headed to the East Wing for a conversation in an office that believed conversations were for other people. The road there would be all badge checks and fluorescent light and the sort of faceless carpet that swallows footfall. Jace didn't need to like the hallways, she needed to disarm their advantage. Before they split, Merrick took a second with Hargrove. No speeches, just a shared understanding, he would do the part only he could do, exactly and without flourish. The judge nodded, aging 10 years and shedding 10 pounds of arrogance in the space between 2 breaths. Sometimes restitution is as simple as refusing to be wrong twice. The convoy rolled under the base lights, Suburbans that announced nothing, drivers who looked like every other driver. Jace sat behind the passenger seat with the tablet on her knee, watching the plan breathe. Comms stayed dark until they didn't. The city slid past, freeway signs, sodium haze, a plane banking toward the bay, none of it registering beyond its relationship to time. Action doesn't quicken her pulse, it slows the world until each variable finds its lane. At the server room, Team 1 moved like they'd already been there last week. Clipboards, lanyards, neutral smiles, the camouflage of bureaucracy. The technicians were real and unwitting, eager to please the people they thought outranked them. Sierra guided them into a story where nothing strange happened and nothing permanent was done. The room hummed with the sound every data center shares, a throat-clearing drone that swallows human conversation. On monitor 3, a status bar prepared to lie about progress at exactly 2300 hours. Across the river, the East Wing swallowed Jace and Merrick whole. Security wands ticked, guards blinked, badges flashed. Offices glowed cold. The corridors held that late-night emptiness where every sound is larger than it should be. Warwick's door sat at the end of a short hall like a period at the end of a long memo. Inside, a desk waited with screens that looked busy enough to be important. Outside, 2 NCIS agents posted at angles that said, cooperative until we're not. Jace's knock wasn't a courtesy, it was a metronome. The plan hit its downbeat, servers shifting states, logs wanting to erase themselves, a bureaucrat reaching for language to make sabotage sound like housekeeping. Sierra's loop engaged, feeding the system the green it expected while siphoning off the truth for cold storage no one outside 4 names knew existed. A red line flickered on monitor 3 and then steadied into a calm, friendly blue. Purge attempted. Purge reported successful. Purge failed. Data duplicated, salted, and tagged to the second. In Warwick's office, movement paused the way prey pauses when it knows the brush has eyes. There are moments where a career collapses without a sound. That was one of them. He reached for a phone he wouldn't get to use. Hargrove's warrant stamped in, timestamps dovetailing with status logs from a room he'd never step inside. NCIS hands were gentle and final at once. No celebration anywhere. Team 1 kept their cadence until the last checksum kissed the archive. Jace didn't exhale, she doesn't waste breath. She took the measure of a night that tried to write over 5 years and failed because people who build their lives around silence insisted the truth didn't belong to politics. The wind had lined up. Defense had become action. And there was still one more chapter to write before the system would stop pretending it hadn't met her. Jace was already packing the next move into the space between heartbeats. The archive was safe, the warrants were live, Warwick was in a hallway learning how fast power evaporates when the lights change. But the work never ends at an office door. It ends out where the air is thin and the math is honest. Sierra fed a sliver of intelligence through the secure channel while the last checksum rolled green, a high-confidence pattern match on Korvik, the ghost whose name rode shotgun on too many casualty reports. A 4-hour window. An address you only ever see once. The shift from corridors to contingency took seconds. Merrick read the traffic and didn't posture. Authorization followed the facts. Fallon's reply from Fort Liberty was clean and immediate, mission parameters updated, deconfliction pushed to the top of the stack. Maddox handled the team with a quiet that meant readiness, not calm. The route planner laid a line across mountains where maps go approximate and weather rights disclaimers. JSOC spun up a bird that didn't exist to anyone on paper, logistics smoothed like cloth pulled tight. Jace moved through prep like a ritual she respected but didn't romanticize. Rifle case open to familiar weight and edges. Bolt cycling once to feel the metal speak. Optics checked, ranges bracketed, dope cards skimmed and then set aside because the night would write its own corrections. Layers for cold that knifes joints and steals small movements. She ate like it was fuel, not food. She slept for 7 minutes with her eyes closed and her mind tidying noise into folders she could ignore. Insertion came without theatrics. Air that bit hard at the teeth. Terrain that imposed its will on human ankles. Sierra's file named the Vantage Overwatch Ridge because operators name things for function, not poetry. The ridge was a broken lip of rock with a lesson in every gust. Maddox placed the ground team on their crawl routes, angles stacked for collapse or success with equal discipline. Comms stayed sparse, one-word updates, numbers instead of adjectives, a cadence that lets time stretch without fraying. Jace bellied behind stone that held the day's heat like a grudging favor. She built the position in small decisions, a fistful of gravel brushed aside so recoil wouldn't skate, a sling tweak, a cheek weld that fit without thought. Through glass, the compound resolved from rumor into geometry. Security moved where security always moves when it thinks it's earned routine. Light cones swept and missed the places they'd missed last night. Doors opened and closed on schedules that felt confident. Confidence is a target, too. Wind never arrives as a single truth. It arrives in layers. Low scrub hissed left to right at one speed, the little eddies high in the saddle wrote a different script, the space over the compound told its own story in heat ripple and indifferent drift. Jace let her breathing erase itself until pulse faded from the scope. She counted patterns the way some people count prayers. Within the compound, a vehicle approached at an angle that fought the terrain less than it should have. A man who doesn't love the land is a man who hasn't lived with it. That fit Korvik's file. Time slowed without drama. Maddox whispered a number that matched what her glass already knew. Ground team shifted half-body to cover the contingency no one wants and everyone plans. Somewhere below, a generator coughed, regained composure, and smoothed into a purr. A door swung. Shadows became shoulders. The face came into focus in 3 small movements, hat brim raised, chin set, eyes scanning with entitlement rather than fear. Confirmation lived in the ratio of cheekbone to beard line, in a scar that hadn't faded the way rumors said it had. Jace let air out slowly and let everything else go with it, courtroom, patch, paperwork, opinions, applause. The world narrowed to mils and seconds. At this distance, a trigger is not a finger, it's a promise. Her hold settled where math meets instinct, a place she'd built brick by brick across a dozen winters. Squeeze, don't negotiate. The shot broke like a sentence ending where it always meant to end. Impact came a breath later, the kind of collapse that removes argument from a body. Security detonated into motion, but motion without a target is noise. She didn't admire the result. The next round lived in the chamber because chaos has a way of printing new hierarchies. 2 shapes moved to drag the fallen out of view. One carried differently, waist too stiff, arms too careful. Jace read the tell and corrected 1/10, wind kissed another 10th, glass confirmed. Break. The second dropped, the first let go from shock instead of planning. The compound learned something it would not be able to use. Maddox called the pivot, ground team folding the contingency back into a clean exit. No trophies. No proof for cameras. Just absence where presence had been. Extraction is never romantic. Feet fail if you let triumph borrow any oxygen. The route home hung sharp along ridge lines that punish pride. Jace policed brass out of reflex and respect, shouldered the rifle like a tool, not a relic, and moved. Radio discipline held. Silence carried them farther than speed. The bird arrived as arranged, all dark angles and discipline. Sierra melted back into anonymity, the way rivers disappear under gravel and continue just the same. Back at Naval Special Warfare HQ, the debrief didn't pretend to be anything other than arithmetic. Mission time, environmental notes, decisions explained only where doctrine demanded explanation. Merrick listened like a man counting stars he'd once doubted he would see. Fallon's feed stitched in confirmation from sources that care about outcomes and not press releases. JSOC analysts said the word decisive into a secure channel like a diagnosis finally named. Wythe sat in a corner he hadn't earned and learned how to hear without speaking. Hargrove, invited under a level that made him careful with his eyes, watched the geometry of competence erase the rhetoric he'd once enjoyed. Warwick's process moved on a parallel rail toward a courtroom less polished, with doors that don't open from the inside. Hollister's cooperation poured out like a dam that had been waiting for a crack. The purge logs aligned with orders he'd claimed were routine. Routine had lost its alibi. The investigation's language grew teeth. Politics cooled when facts stayed cold no matter who touched them. Jace let others handle the part that belongs to signatures and seals. She went to the range behind the HQ when the sun was no longer angry and ran a quiet 100 yards of paper because rituals exist to build floors, not walls. She cleaned glass and steel and memory with the same cloth. Maddox walked over, didn't interrupt, set a hard case on the bench, and left it there. Inside, a short note about training cadres and timelines and a list of names who would arrive with questions and leave with standards. Reyes's name sat near the top, written in a hand that didn't decorate. When she closed the case, the night had shifted from mission to aftermath without asking permission. The kill patch went back where it lives, out of sight because significance doesn't need an audience. Merrick found her on the patio where sea air tastes like iron. He didn't offer congratulations, he offered next steps. The trident, official this time, would be recorded where it should have been. The training command would need a director who understood measured silence and loud outcomes. The program would remain layered and quiet, but visible enough inside the right rooms to end arguments that sap talent. Jace listened and mapped. The road ahead wasn't glamour, it was infrastructure. It was teaching shooters to respect a wind that doesn't care about anyone's plan. It was training commanders to see classification as a scalpel, not a broom. It was hard work in rooms without windows, decisions made on behalf of people who will never know they benefited. At 02, when the compound halfway around the world had cooled and the after-action chatter died down to the hum of servers storing truths no one would get to browse, she stood alone under a Coronado sky that finally remembered how to be kind. Somewhere in the silence a plane banked, lights winking like patient metronomes. She thought of Schaefer's star on the memorial and the families who would not receive details and the candidates who would show up next month thinking, first, is still in front of them. The system would not pretend anymore, not in the rooms that matter. The wind had lined up, the shot had landed, the path had opened. And now, with the ridge behind her and the courtroom outgrown, she turned toward the work of building something that would last longer than any headline she would never have meant, starting before dawn and ending after lights out, stacking quiet decisions until they formed a spine. The first week moved like a controlled burn. NCIS sealed the purge case, logs were hashed, mirrored, and boxed in evidence containers that clacked like verdicts. Warwick slid from influence to inventory, his calendar replaced by chain of custody tags. Hollister, eyes hollow from fluorescent rooms and hard questions, signed statements that turned routine review into a map of intent. The narrative stopped being a debate and became a timeline with signatures. Inside NSW Command, the fix wasn't a press release, it was plumbing. Shadow archives that had lived like a second heartbeat were now wired formally into oversight loops, not louder, just unavoidable. SKIF briefings added a line at the bottom of slides that used to lie by omission: Sierra activity documented under compartment X, cross-referenced by audit Y. No leaks. No victory laps. Just an end to the bureaucratic magic trick where absence masqueraded as truth. Hargrove asked to see Merrick and came alone, not because protocol required it but because contrition is smaller when it's shared. He spoke little, and what he said landed clean. He had held certainty too early, he had allowed common sense to do the prosecuting. He'd keep the bench, but he would carry the lesson in every ruling with teeth. Wythe drifted in a day later and didn't try to qualify anything. He simply acknowledged that evidence which flatters a bias should raise, not lower, your bar. Both men were allowed to sit in a training observation once, to watch candidates grind across Coronado sand while wind flattened their tidy ideas into salt and grit. Neither applauded. They just learned where grit comes from. The Trident paperwork came through without ceremony. A clerk who didn't know and didn't need to know pressed the stamp that made a private fact official in a registry that almost no one reads. Jace slid the insignia into a pocket already occupied by the patch. One for rooms where truth can speak, one for the spaces where it can only be implied. She didn't post a photo. She didn't tell a story. She filed a copy and moved on. Then came the work she had chosen, building the thing that would outlast her. The new training command took over a wing of the Coronado complex that smelled like clean paint and unmade history. Reyes arrived with a notebook full of questions and a way of listening that kept answers honest. Maddox sketched the scaffolding, modules that bent, not broke, standards that refused to apologize for being hard, lanes for precision work where patience and math sit at the head of the table. The syllabus avoided slogans. It favored outcomes: wind reading as literacy, glass discipline as meditation, target discrimination as ethics, comms cadence as leadership, debrief as accountability instead of theater. Jace wrote the doctrine the way she shoots, one input per line, no fever. She stripped out the mythology people try to wrap around lethality. Students learned that heroism is a failure mode, professionalism is the point. They learned that classification is not a cloak to hide incompetence but a scalpel to reduce risk. They learned that merit survives audit and arrogance does not. On the first Friday, she stood behind the line while a row of shooters tried to make a 1-minute group breathe. Reyes walked the line, voice level, turning flinch into follow-through. When the paper came back, a young lieutenant saw 5 holes touching and blinked twice, disbelieving. Jace didn't smile, she nodded once and tapped the wind flag. The lesson is never the shot, it's the adjustment. Institution shifted by inches elsewhere. JSOC codified cross-team tasking for specialized elements with a form you couldn't forget to file. Audit trails were written so elegantly they felt invisible, that's how you get commanders to use them. Promotion boards received access to redacted performance signals that told the truth without burning sources. Language changed in rooms that matter, no more lowered standards as shorthand for integration, no more smirks in corners where ignorance thinks it's safe. Schaefer's family received a visit they did not expect and could not talk about. The briefing didn't dwell on details, but it recorded her cross, a citation that would survive the next migration and the next. A box they had kept closed got opened carefully, a folded flag looked less like a symbol and more like a ledger balanced. Jace didn't attend. She walked past the memorial instead, fingers brushing the star that had always been hers to see. Silence did what speeches cannot. The courtroom chapter closed with a line that looked dull on paper and felt decisive in practice: charges dismissed with prejudice, classification caveats attached, records corrected in systems that once pretended they couldn't. There was no public vindication. There was a functionally perfect internal one, which is the only kind that matters when your work is built to leave no footprint. She kept her own cadence steady. Mornings at the range, afternoons in rooms where dry erase fumes meet doctrine, evenings walking the seawall until the day washed off like sand. She let Reyes own more and more of the whiteboard, watched the younger officer turn recommendations into rhythm, corrected only where drift threatened to become dogma. Maddox took a rotation back forward, the way men like him have to in order to stay honest. He left a stack of names on her desk, candidates who would arrive sure they were exceptional and leave sure they were accountable. A memo landed from DC 1 week later, all uppercase headings and mild triumph hidden between lines. The Intel Committee postponed its hearing indefinitely pending internal reforms. Attached, a quietly seismic annex, acknowledgement within proper channels that women have, in fact, executed direct action under special access since dates the public timeline still denies. Not a parade. Not a leak. A correction entered into the only ledger that can pay debts like these. At month's end, the first cohort stood on the line at sunset, their shadows long, their chatter tight with the good kind of nerves. Jace said very little. She pointed at the wind, the light, the background clutter that would trick the eye, the tiny lies that the world tells your sights. She spoke once about duty, not the flag-waving version, the quiet one where you carry truths you can't repeat and still manage not to bend them for convenience. Then she stepped back and let them fail in small ways they could repair. That night, after the brass had cooled and the targets were taped, she returned to her office, which was still more table than furniture. The patch and the trident lay side by side for a moment while she sorted paperwork into piles that would become process. One for shadow. One for record. Both for service. She put them away without ceremony. Merrick stopped by on his way to a flight. He didn't ask for updates. He scanned the room the way a commander counts exits and saw a program taking its first settled breaths. He left a thin envelope on the desk, budget approved, billets unlocked, a note in his handwriting that said only, keep the lane open. She didn't need to answer. It was already doctrine. Coronado's night wind came through the cracked window, bringing the smell of salt and concrete and jet fuel. The building clicked as it cooled. Somewhere on base a cadence called the last mile of a unit that didn't know who was writing its future and didn't need to. Jace looked at tomorrow's roster and circled 3 names that would need more time. She penciled in an hour where an hour didn't exist, because that's how foundations get poured, one impossible block scraped into being. By the time she shut off the lights, the story had shifted fully from defense to design. The archive was safe. The ledger was corrected. The path was visible, if only to the people who had to walk it. And in the quiet between tasks, she understood the only resolution that counts in work like this, not applause, not headlines, just systems that will not fail the next person who shows up ready to carry more than her share. That was the point, and it stayed the point on mornings when the wind came wrong and nothing grouped the way it should. Jace kept the tempo unglamorous, brief, train, debrief, fix. She learned the names that mattered and forgot the ones that were noise. Reyes handled intake with a surgeon's calm, turning chaos into lanes without announcing the trick. Maddox checked in from forward, short bursts, tight signals, a list of lessons that belonged in doctrine, not in myth. The program found its stride in the same way a shooter finds natural point of aim, not all at once, but by removing everything that isn't needed. There was no plaque for the archive that didn't get erased and no ceremony for the court that learned humility under lock and key. There were, however, quieter monuments. Audit alerts that once slept now woke at the right second. A form that didn't exist before now captured the truth in 5 boxes and a signature no one could pretend not to see. Promotion boards began recognizing work that had previously passed through like ghost weather. The corrections didn't shout, they accumulated until even the stubborn noticed the light had changed. Jace kept her patch and her trident where they lived best, out of sight, inside reach. On some days, the weight felt like ballast, a reminder to keep the keel down when wind threatened to throw the bow. On others, it felt like an IOU signed in other people's names, Schaefer's among them, that she would pay by refusing to let shortcuts masquerade as speed. She visited the memorial in off hours, before the base woke up, and practiced saying nothing. Silence had always been the work's first language, she wasn't going to forget it now that some rooms had learned to listen. The cohort rotated. Some washed out. Not for headlines, for cause. Not because standards were cruel, because standards were a promise made to people who would one day stand behind them. The ones who stayed learned how to measure more than yard lines. They measured drift in judgment under fatigue, the way adrenaline lies about competence, the cost of an extra word on the net. Reyes taught them to breathe through the urge to be impressive. Maddox taught them to leave rooms cleaner than they found them. Jace taught them to respect wind because it respects no one in return. Hargrove returned once, unannounced, and stood at the edge of the range like a man auditing himself. He didn't ask to speak. He watched a young officer pull a shot left, watched Reyes move a half step, watched Jace say 2 words that recentered everything. Later he left a note on the admin counter, "Thank you for letting me learn after I should have known." It wasn't absolution. It was a receipt. Wythe came through in another way. A memo circulated within JAG that read like contrition disguised as guidance. It warned prosecutors against treating absence as falsehood in cases where classification shaped the map. It cited nothing and changed everything. Quiet revolutions live in footnotes. From DC, Merrick's updates arrived in sentences that spent half their ink on verbs: established, codified, implemented. Warwick moved from detention to trial to a disappearing point on a docket. Hollister's cooperation became a line item in a case that will be taught to investigators who haven't been hired yet. Fallon forwarded a one-liner after a closed session on the Hill: "We told them just enough." In the world Jace knows, just enough is sometimes the bravest amount. On the last day of the quarter, fog came in off the Pacific and made Coronado a study in grayscale. Jace ran the morning on irons only, no glass, no crutches, because the ocean doesn't care for your preferences. The cohort threaded shots through air that moved like a rumor. Progress looked like 2 groups that no longer lied to the shooter about who caused the miss. When it was done, she signed off the roster and tucked 3 names into a smaller box: candidates who would be asked to carry more than skill, discretion, gravity, the willingness to be anonymous and still be accountable. Reyes, who had learned the rhythm enough to predict the rests, brought coffee and a stack of forms. "Budget's clean," she said. "Gear is late." Jace nodded. "Gear is always late, that's why you build people before equipment." They talked through schedules, rotated instructors, carved an hour for a class on after-action honesty, not the theatrical kind. Then Reyes hesitated. "Ma'am," she said, leaving rank on the table as respect, not distance, "you should see something." She pulled a folded letter from the in-tray. It was from Schaefer's family. The words were simple and unadorned: gratitude without extraction of details they knew they could never have. There was a line about sleeping easier. There was a line about pride that didn't need spectacle. Jace read it twice, then once more, and put it in the drawer where she keeps maps of places that no longer exist and still do. Some debts you pay by not spending the currency on yourself. Afternoon brought a small ceremony with no press and the wrong kind of cake, attended by people whose names never trend. The first cohort graduated the phase that matters. Maddox, back on base for a blink, shook hands with the economy of a man who trusts grips more than speeches. Merrick said 2 sentences that didn't waste air. Jace said one: "Hold the standard when no one is watching." They pinned nothing. They issued nothing shiny. They released a group of professionals into a world that will never know how much worse it could have been without them. That night, the base settled into the blue hour and the training wing clicked as the day's heat departed. Jace lingered at the whiteboard, erasing a wind lesson and leaving the ghost of it in the sheen. Reyes flipped off lights until only the office glowed. "Tomorrow," she said, and it sounded like confidence, not fatigue. Maddox left a message on the secure line, 3 words that landed like a promise: "Lane stays open." Fallon's initials blinked on a restricted feed with a timestamp and a thumbs up no one would ever admit seeing. Hargrove's docket reflected a new case flagged for special access review before it screwed up. Wythe's memo got quoted in a meeting where no one mentioned its author. Jace walked the seawall under a sky cut by aircraft heading somewhere that would remain redacted. The wind was steady enough to trust. She thought about beginnings that looked like accusations and endings that looked like infrastructure. She thought about the difference between being believed and being necessary, and why the latter had always been the safer bet. She touched the pocket where Patch and Trident lived side by side and felt neither triumph nor weight, only alignment, the record catching up to the reality it had ridden behind for too long. From the far side of the base came the measured call of cadence, the reply of boots on pavement, the small music of people learning to move together. She stopped at the memorial because endings are better when they acknowledge what they cost. The stars in the marble didn't change, but they seemed less lonely. Somewhere, a young officer who would never meet her was packing a bag for a selection she wouldn't post about. Somewhere, a clerk who understood more than his job description admitted typed a code that made a truth permanent. Somewhere, a judge resisted the comfort of easy consensus and asked one more hard question. When she finally turned toward home, it wasn't toward a house so much as toward continuity. Morning would bring wind and numbers and a new stack of forms, and she would be ready for each in equal measure. Not because the world would ever notice, but because the work deserved it. In a life built out of inches and seconds and choices you can't brag about, that is the kind of victory you can keep. The story didn't end in a headline, it ended, or better, continued, in a system less likely to betray the people who carry it. That was the lesson and the promise. If the next operator walked in from the dark, carrying more than her share, the doors would open, the records would hold, the wind would be taught honestly, and the lane would stay open. And that, Jace thought as she stepped back into the quiet that has always been home, was enough.